Konnichiwa, I'm John Hornick. Welcome to Chef's Apprentice. This lesson is in my Japanese Faves series. You can also take my course of 104 cooking lessons called Learning to Cook Like a Pro, One Small Plate at a Time. It starts off easy, gets progressively harder, and ends with the ultimate challenge, which is actually 5 lessons in one. Also, watch my other special series, such as Italian Faves, Impress Your Date, and Sauces to Die For. Now, this lesson is about how to order sake in a restaurant. It's about understanding the words that are on the front label or the back label. And I'll teach you the basic terms that you may see on a restaurant sake list or on the sake bottle itself, or terms that the server may use. Now, sake is an alcoholic beverage like no other. It has an incomparable taste. I've been asked on many occasions to try to compare it to something else, and I can't. I just can't come up with anything to compare it to. Sake, unlike any other beverage, has a double fermentation. It gets fermented with both koji and with yeast. And now koji is kind of a friendly mold or fungus. And it's not like wine or beer. Wine and beer are fermented, but they're only fermented once. And it's not like spirits because it's not distilled. Now, most sakes today are made in Japan. There are sakes that are made elsewhere. There are sakes that are made in the United States. But most of them are made in Japan. And they're made from basically 4 ingredients. Rice, and it's almost always rice that's made from making sake. About 1% of rice production in Japan is sake rice, and that's used to make sake. Another ingredient is koji, which I mentioned, and water. And water comes from precious sources. This just isn't just any water. There's a lot of special, revered sources of water in Japan. Japan gets a lot of rainfall and snowfall and has a lot of water. And then the 4th ingredient is yeast. And these are basically the same yeasts that are used to make beer. Now, sake can have an alcohol content from about 1% up to about 22%. And the average is about 15 to 16%. But there's a couple of sakes that I'm going to talk about today which actually have an alcohol content of 18% and 18.5%, which is actually pretty high. When sake is made, it must involve some type of pressing or filtering. And that's going to be relevant when we talk about nigori. So all sake is pressed or filtered to some degree. Now, sake can be dry or it can be sweet, and it can have varying levels of acidity. And we'll talk about that later on in the lesson. Now, let's talk about the types of sake. A basic type of sake is called futsushu. Futsushu. Now, this is an everyday sake. Probably you won't see this term on a sake bottle label or on a wine list or a sake list, but this is just basically common everyday table sake. Then there's Junmai. Now, Junmai is sake that's made only from water, koji, and rice. Right? That's what Junmai means. It's made only from water, koji, and rice. This is a finer sake. It's finer than the futsushu. Then there's Aru-10, ARU-10 sakes. Now that term, you probably won't see that on a wine list or a sake list either, and probably not even on a bottle. This means that there is alcohol added when making the sake. So the sake is made with water, koji, rice, and added distilled alcohol. That's a class of sake called Aru-10. Now, let's talk a little bit about rice polish ratio. Now, rice polish ratio is something that's relevant to the finer sakes. In Japanese, it's called semibui. And you may see it abbreviated, rice polish ratio, abbreviated as RPR. And this means the percentage of rice remaining after the polishing. So if you see that a sake says 60% RPR, it means there is 60% or less of the rice kernel remaining after the polishing step. Now let's talk about the type of sake plus the rice polishing ratio. Now, Aru-10 sakes, Aru-10, that's the class of alcohol added sakes. Remember, that's water, koji, rice, and alcohol. The basic, or kind of the bottom level of Aro 10 is called Hanjozo sakes. And Hanjozos have to have a rice polish ratio of 70% or less of the rice kernel remaining. The next step up is Ginjo sakes. You've probably heard this term. Now, Ginjo sakes have to have 60% or less of the rice kernel remaining. And then the top level is Daiginjo. And Daiginjo sakes have 50% or less of the kernel remaining. Now, that's Aro 10 sakes. That's sakes that have had alcohol added to them in the brewing process. Now, the other basic category is Junmai sakes. Now, Junmai sakes are only, remember, I said this before, water, koji, and rice. Water, koji, and rice. That's a Junmai. Now, if it's just a straight Junmai, there is no rice polishing required, and it can have 100% or less of the rice kernel remaining. Now, Junmai Ginjo, remember we talked about Ginjo before, but it was Ginjo that had alcohol added, so it's not called Junmai Ginjo, because remember, Junmai means it doesn't have any added alcohol. It's just water, koji, and rice. So a Junmai Ginjo is 60% or less of the rice kernel remaining. Junmai Daiginjo is 50% or less of the rice kernel remaining. And there's no Hanjozo here. Why? Why is there no Hanjozo step? The reason is because Hanjozo has alcohol added and Junmais don't. So you can't have a Junmai Hanjozo. Okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about Futsushu. Now, Futsushu, remember, that is the basic table sake. About 65% of sake production in Japan is Futsushu. It's basically, it's nothing special about it. And you probably won't see this word on bottles of sake or on a sake list or wine list, because why advertise it? Why advertise that this is a basic table sake? Now, if the sake bottle or the list doesn't have one of the following terms, it's probably Futsushu, okay? If it doesn't say tokubetsu, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment, if it doesn't say tokubetsu, if it doesn't say Junmai, Ginjo, or Daiginjo, it's probably a common table sake of Futsushu. Now let's talk about other important sake terms. One is the word I just used, tokubetsu. Tokubetsu means special. So if you see tokubetsu on a bottle, and I think this bottle right here, right on this vertical label, it says tokubetsu. That means special. It just means that the brewer has designated that particular sake that it's made as a special of whatever it is. Okay, so tokubetsu means special. Now Genshu, and again, Genshu is on this bottle too. Genshu means that it's undiluted, right? So in the sake brewing process, with many sakes, there's water added at a certain step in the process. With Genshu, it's undiluted, although kind of a little technical loophole of that is that you can have about 1% of water by weight that's been added to the sake, and you can still call it Genshu. But basically, Genshu means undiluted sake. You may also see the term Shinpaku. Now, this isn't going to be so common. Shinpaku actually means the white kernel, or the white heart of the rice kernel. And it's very starchy, and my camera cut off there for a moment. I was talking about Shinpaku. Sometimes brewers will want to emphasize that they have polished the rice to some level of RPR, and they may use the term Shinpaku in the name of the sake. Also, you may see the term awa, A-W-A. That's sparkling sake. Now, I haven't seen too much sparkling sake in the United States, but awa sakes are sparkling sakes. You may see the term taru, T-A-R-U. That means that the sake has been produced in a wooden barrel. Another term you may see is koshu. Koshu means that the sake has been aged at least 3 years. Could be longer, but at least 3 years to be called koshu. Now let's talk about nama sakes. Nama relates to pasteurization, and if it's a nama sake, then it means it's been unpasteurized to some degree. Now, nama sakes tend to be more live. They tend to be kind of interesting, kind of complex, kind of exciting. They need to be refrigerated. There can be two different types namasakes because there are two different types of pasteurization in making sake. One is called namazume, and in namazume sakes, that means they got only the first of the two pasteurizations. Namachozo sakes received only the second of the two pasteurizations. One of them is before storage and one is before bottling. So namazume sakes got the pasteurization right before storage, and namachozo sakes got the pasteurization right before bottling. Now you may see namanama. Namanama means it got neither one of those two pasteurizations, but usually if it's a totally unpasteurized sake, it will just say namasake. That means it didn't get either one. If it got one of the two pasteurizations, you'll see either namachozo or namazume. Now, kind of a generic term that's being used in the sake industry, if the producer doesn't want to designate which of the two pasteurizations it didn't get, they might just say namasake. Rather than saying nama or namanama, which means no pasteurization at all, they might just say namasake. And that means it got at least one of the two pasteurizations was skipped. Now, let's talk about some other important terms. First, let's talk about filtration. Now, to be called sake in Japan, it must have had some pressing or filtration, right? Now, if a sake has been, so if it's been pressed, it still might not be filtered at all. And if it's been pressed but not filtered, it's called muroka. And you may see the term muroka on the bottle also, but not on this one. I do have some murokas we're going to talk about a little bit later. And now a muroka sake, it's unfiltered, but it was pressed to remove the sake leaves, or the what's called the sake kazu. It's the sediment of the rice that precipitates in the sake as it's being made. Then there's tansu roka. Now muroka means not filtered. Tansu roka means that it's been filtered with activated carbon, and su-roka means it's been filtered without activated carbon. So these are terms you may see on sake lists or on sake bottles. Now, nigori, which is very common and popular in the United States, nigori actually means literally cloudy sake, okay? Now, sometimes in restaurants or on lists, they will say this is unfiltered sake. That's not right. Unfiltered is muroka. But remember, all sakes have been at least pressed. So if it hasn't been filtered at all, it's muroka. Nigori has been coarsely filtered, right? So there's been some filtration in the making of the nigori. And in nigori, it's cloudy. The sediment may settle to the bottom of the bottle in some of them, and the idea is to shake it up before you drink it. In others, it stays cloudy all the time. Now, I want to talk about two very special terms, Komoto and Yamahai. Now, Komoto is an old-fashioned way of making sake. And in the sake making process, at the very beginning, the brewers add lactic acid to inhibit the growth of unwanted bacteria. And 95% of sakes made today involve the adding of lactic acid intentionally. But in the old-fashioned Komoto method, the brewers would allow the lactic acid to form naturally from the air in the brewery. And this was the Komoto, part of the Komoto method. The other part of the Komoto method was that the brewers, and the brewers, by the way, are called toji, T-O-J-I, they allow the natural development of the lactic acid, and they also go through a very laborious stirring step where they stir up the mash, or actually the fermentation starter. And here it's the rice, it's the koji, it's the water, and there's a very laborious step of stirring it all up called yama oroshi, right? Now that's Komoto. You allow the lactic acid to develop naturally, and then you go through the yama oroshi stirring step to make Komoto sakes. Now there's another variation on that called Yamahai. Now Yamahai sakes, they still allow the lactic acid to develop naturally. But around 1900 or so, somebody said, hey, we can make this sake allowing the lactic acid to develop naturally. We can make that, and we don't have to do this laborious yama-oroshi step. So they stopped doing that. And if they make the sake without doing that stirring step, then it's called yamahai. Now, only about 5% of sakes made today are either kumoto or yamahai. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of them a little bit later on. Let's talk a little bit about price, because you're ordering sake in a restaurant. And ginjos, the finer sakes, the ginjos, the daiginjos, the hanjozos, the tokubetsu, remember that means special, or the kosho, which means aged, koshu, which means aged. These are probably priced higher than futsushu, but I've seen a whole range of pricing, and some futushus are being kind of marketed in the United States as finer sake, even though they aren't really, and they're being sold for prices that are comparable to ginjo, daiginjo, or some kind of a tokubetsu. Now, higher priced sakes probably taste better than lower priced sakes, but it's really a matter of taste. You might find that you like a lower price sake more than you like a higher price sake. Daiginjo and Junmai Ginjo, which are the top of the line in terms of how much rice has been polished away, they may not be priced higher than ginjos or Junmai Ginjos, even though they've gone through less rice polishing. And it has a lot to do with marketing. It has a lot to do with how much the brewer thinks of the sake. If they make a sake that's a ginjo or a Junmai Ginjo and they think it's really good, they might price it higher than some other brewer's daiginjo. Now, that same brewer is going to price their daiginjo higher than their ginjo, but they may price their ginjo higher than some other brewer prices their daiginjo. But again, don't get hung up on price alone. Look for some of the terms I've discussed. You'll know what they mean, and you can make a judgment. You can say, oh, this is a tokubetsu. It's special. I'd like to try that. Or you can say, this is a genshu. I know that hasn't been diluted. I think I'll try that. Or you might say, this is a namasake. It hasn't been pasteurized. That might be more kind of lively, so I'm going to try that. Don't pay so much attention to price. Trust your taste. Now let's talk a little bit about the label. Now, the front label on a lot of sake bottles is entirely in Japanese. And this is changing somewhat. I'll have some bottles today that are entirely Japanese and some others that are partly in Japanese. And so there's more of them being sold in the U.S. now that are not entirely in Japanese, but it's still very common that you'll have a front label. It's all in Japanese. You're not going to know what it says unless the sake list or the wine list tells you or the server happens to know. Now, the back label might not say much. Now, this back label does have a little bit of information on it. It has the alcohol volume, it has the RPR, it has sake, it has the SMV number, which I'll talk about a little bit later. That's the sake meter value, and it also has the acidity. So this back label does have a fair amount of information, but you also may see a lot of back labels that don't say much at all. The sake list or the wine list in the restaurant may provide some additional information, and it may not. So, when you're ordering sake, if you want to try something interesting, you might ask the server if they can bring something that they think is interesting, and look at the bottle. See if it has any of these terms on it that we're talking about, if they don't appear on the wine list itself. Now, more and more sake labels are appearing with in English or more English. And that's because the U.S. market has become a really big market for sake producers in Japan. So we're starting to see more and more English on the label. And the label also provides information about, it may provide information about the brewing method, like I mentioned. It may say it's a kumoto or yamahai. It might tell you the style, and it will also tell you, in many cases, about the brewery and where the brewery is located. I'll talk a little bit about that, a little more about that as I go on. Now, many sakes have, in fact, most sakes have a cool name. This one doesn't, but I have a couple others that do. For example, I have one called Seven Spearmen. Got a little story about that. I'll talk about that a little bit later. There's another one called Rhythm of the Centuries. Pretty cool. And my own sake that I brew myself, I call it Snow Dog because I have Siberian Huskies. Now you'll also see terms that we discussed on, you may see them on the label. This one here says Tokubetsu, Hanjozo, and Genshu. So that means it's special, it has alcohol added, and it's undiluted. And you'll also probably see the rice polish ratio if it's either a Hanjozo, a Ginjo, or a Dai Ginjo, or a Junmai Ginjo, or a Junmai Dai Ginjo. It will also give you some information about the brewery and the location and the region. And if you want to learn more about sake, this is a place to take a deeper dive because there's a lot of sake that comes out of certain regions of Japan. I'm not going to go into that today. It's beyond kind of the scope of this lesson. But if you want to learn more about sakes, a great way to learn is to learn about the regions that produce sakes. As I mentioned, the bottle also may have the SMV. That's the sake meter value. And that's a number, a minus number or a plus number. Minus number means it may be sweeter. Plus number means it may be drier. I'll talk more about that. It may also have the acidity. This bottle has both SMV and acidity. It will also have the alcohol content. This bottle has that. Some bottles will also tell you the variety of rice that was used to make the sake. And I can't remember offhand, I think there are about 100 different rice varieties that are used only to make sake. And many of them are revered in Japan. They're special. The brewers are very proud of using that rice. So in some cases, they will tell you what kind of rice they used to make the sake. If the sake is aged, they may also tell you how long it was aged. And I have one or two examples of aged sake, and I'll talk about that more. And it may also tell you the bottling date. Okay, so that's the type of information you're going to see on the label, although not all labels will have all of that information. Now let's look at some bottles. As I mentioned before, the name of the sake may or may not have been translated. And the names are often very cool, and I'll show you some examples of that. And the words on the bottles may also appear on the sake list to help you order. Otherwise, look at the bottle itself after they bring it to you and see what you got. Or if the server seems like he or she has some knowledge about sake, then you could ask maybe to bring a couple of ones they think are interesting, and you might be able to get some information about the sake by looking at the words that are on the bottle, which may not be on the sake list. And I've found that more and more servers today know something about sake. A lot of servers find sake to be fascinating. They find it as a thing that they'd like to learn about. If the restaurant is serving sake, then they're probably encouraging the servers to learn about it. So there are more and more servers today who know something about sake. Now let's look at some bottles. Okay, so this is the first bottle that we're going to talk about. This one is called Yuho, and it has a very cool name, Rhythm of the Centuries. Now this is a Junmai, which means, remember, Junmai means it's made only with, it doesn't have added alcohol, it has only rice, koji, and water. And it says in the bottle that it's been polished to a 55% RPR. This means there's 55% or less of the kernel remaining after polishing. Now, this is it's called, they call it a Junmai, but because it's been polished to 55% or less, that means they could call it a Ginjo, but they don't. I don't know why they don't. This is also a Komoto. Remember, Komoto means that it goes through that old-fashioned method, and they use the Yama-oroshi labor-intensive stirring method to make this sake. And this is also an aged sake, a Komoto. I'm sorry, it's a kushu. Kushu means aged. And this has been aged for 4 years. Remember, Kushu means it's been aged for at least 3 years. This one's been aged for 4 years. This has a 15.9% alcohol content, and it has an SMV value of +3. +3 means it is supposed to be drier. And I'll talk about SMV and acidity a little bit later on. So it has a, camera cut off again though, it has an SMV of +3 and an acidity of 2.2, which is rather high for acid. Acid's usually between 1 and 2%. So this one has 2.2%. Now the next sake that I want to talk about is this Gasanyu Hazuki, and this has a very cool name also, Spirit of Freedom. All right. Now this is a Junmai Ginjo, and it's been polished to an RPR of 60% or less of the kernel remaining, and it's a Nama sake. Now it doesn't say which of the 2 pasteurization steps was skipped. They just call it a Nama sake, which means it's unpasteurized. They skipped at least one of the 2 pasteurization steps. It's also a Genshu, which means that it hasn't been diluted. It has an alcohol content of 14.2%, which is a little low for a sake, and it has an SMV value of +3 and an acidity of 1.6, which is about average. Okay, and these terms, almost all of those terms actually appear on the label. But as you can see, actually as you see, the front label is still appears to be all in Japanese, but in very, very, very tiny print down here it says Spirit of Freedom. You can barely read it without a magnifying glass. All right, next sake I want to talk about is this one. This one's cool because it comes in a can. I thought this was a really cool container. And this is called Narutotai. And it's a Ginjo with an RPR of 58%, and it's a Nama sake. It doesn't say whether it's Namachozo or Namazume, or whether it's Nama. They just call it a Nama sake. And it's also a Genshu, which means it's been undiluted. Has a high alcohol content, it's highest I have here today, of 18.5%. It's pretty high in alcohol. An SMV value of +5 and an acidity of 1.8. And all of that is on the label. Actually, it says that it's a Ginjo Nama Genshu. Okay, so we know that it's a Ginjo sake. It's Nama unpasteurized and undiluted. And it says that under that, it just says unpasteurized premium rice sake. This sake also has the distinction of having appeared in the movie Blade Runner 2049. That's the remake of Blade, or I should say the continuation of the Blade Runner movie. Cool. All right. Now the next sake that I wanted to show you is kubota Hakiju. All right. And so that's all in Japanese. The front label is all in Japanese. And on the back label, it says that it's a Junmai Ginjo. Remember, Junmai Ginjo means it has no alcohol added in the brewing step. This has an RPR of 50%, which it does not say on the label. Now that is very interesting because if this sake were sold in Japan, it would be required to have the RPR number on it if it says that it's a Ginjo or a Daiginjo. It's being sold in the United States, so it doesn't actually say what its RPR is, which is a little surprising. And this has but this is a Yamahai. Now remember, Yamahai is the old-fashioned brewing method where they skip the Yama Oroshi step and don't do that stirring. So this is Yamahai. And it has a sake meter value of +2, which actually is not on the label. I'm going to tell you how you can find that out if it's not on the label. And an acidity, a low acidity of 1.2. All right. Okay, next one I have for you is this one here, Joyo Junmai 65. Now they've put right in the name of it that it's a Junmai, which means, again, no added alcohol. And they put 65 right in there, so they're telling you what the RPR is right in the name of the sake. Junmai 65. It says on the label that it is a Genshu, so that means it's undiluted, and it's a Namazume, which means it skipped the second fermentation. It also is a Muroka. Muroka, what's that mean? It means it's unfiltered. Now, it's not a Nagori. Nagoris have been lightly filtered. Murokas haven't been filtered at all, but they have been pressed. And it has a, it says on the back that it has an alcohol content of 15%, has an SMV value of +5, so that's pretty dry, or it may be dry. I'll go talk more about that later. And it has an acidity of 1.8, which is kind of high. All right, so let's see. Next one here is Hananumai Katana, all right? And this one has some Japanese on the front label, and it does say extra dry katana in English here. And then it says on the back that it's a Ginjo, and it has a 60% RPR. And this is a Namachozo, which means it skipped that first, or it had the first pasteurization step. And it has an alcohol content of 15.5%, SMV value of +7, really high on the plus side, so supposedly very dry, and an acidity of 1.3%. All right, then we have this bottle that I have been holding up since the beginning of the lesson. And this is a Katafune, and this is a Hanjozo. Remember I mentioned earlier, it says here, Tokubetsu Hanjozo Genshu. Okay, so this is a Hanjozo. It means it had alcohol added in the brewing process. Now this, interestingly, has an RPR of 60%, which means that it qualifies to be a Ginjo. But for some reason, the brewer chose to call it only Hanjozo. They could have called it a Ginjo. Why they didn't, I don't know. It's Tokubetsu's because that means that the brewer thinks it's special, and it's a Genshu, which means that it is undiluted. It has an 18% alcohol volume percentage, and that's pretty high, second highest that I have today. And this has an SMV value of -3. That means it should be somewhat sweet, and an acidity of 1.4. Okay, now this sake here is called Bonryu, and it has two names on the label in English. One is Glorious Mount Fuji, and the other one is 10,000 Ways. But I believe this is a Futushu, okay? And it has a 15.3% alcohol percentage. It doesn't say what its SMV value or its acidity is, and it doesn't say anything about being a Ginjo, a Daiginjo, a Hanjozo. It doesn't give a rice polish ratio. So I believe this is a Futushu, okay? I buy this sake to use for cooking. I think it's pretty good for drinking, but it's reasonable price. I buy it for cooking. Now this one here, small bottle, but I love this sake. This is called Kurosawa, and it's a Junmai. It has an RPR of 65%, but interestingly, they don't call it a Ginjo. Because it's polished to less than 60%, they could call it a Ginjo, but they don't. Why they don't, I don't know. They just call it a Junmai. And this is a Komoto. Remember, Komoto is the old-fashioned method that uses the Yama Oroshi stirring step. And I think this is a very tasty sake. It has a 15% alcohol percentage, SMV value of +2, and it doesn't say what the acidity is. Then we have this Tamamura Ginjo, and Ginjo is a type of rice. So they're telling you right in the, it's right down here at the bottom in English, they're telling you what type of rice they're using. They're very proud of that. Okay, so this is Tamamura Ginjo. It's a Junmai Ginjo, which has a rice polish ratio of 55%, and it says that on the back of the bottle. and it says it has an SMV value of +1 and an acidity of 1.7. Right? Then have this bottle here, which is called Imayo Tsukasa Black. They call it black. That's the name of it, black. All right, and it's a Junmai, but it doesn't. It's a Junmai because it's made only with rice koji and water, but it is not a Ginjo or Daiginjo, so it doesn't tell us what the rice polish ratio is, because Junmai, if it's just Junmai, it doesn't have to have any polishing at all. It tells us that it has a 16% alcohol percentage. Doesn't tell us what the sake meter value or the acidity is. And then last but not least, this is a good one. I like this one. This one is called Shichi Honuri, and its cool name is the Seven Spearmen. It says on the bottle that it is a Junmai, but it also says that it's been polished to 60%, which means they could call it a Ginjo, but they don't. They just call it a Junmai. Why? I don't know. Has a 15% alcohol percentage, and it doesn't tell us what the sake meter value is or the acidity, but what they do tell you is something very cool, and that is that it's named after a battle that was fought outside the brewery in 1583. So this brewery has been around for a long time. Okay, let's talk about what to expect from the bottles you order based upon the words that we've learned today. There are 4 basic flavor profiles for sake. The first is called kunshu, and this is the Ginjos and the Daiginjos. Daiginjos and Ginjos tend to be lighter, fragrant, and fruity. It's a more refined sake, and I view these type of sakes as being kind of a white wine analog. They don't taste like white wine, but if you like white wines, you might find some similarity between the Ginjos and Daiginjos and white wine. So it's kind of an analog, okay? That's kunshu. Now the second flavor profile is called soshu. Now this is not to be confused with sochu, which is a distilled drink. Soshu is a flavor profile that includes Hanjozos. Remember, those are the sakes that has alcohol added when it's being made. The nama sakes, these are the unpasteurized sakes. And the futsushu, which is the everyday table sake. Now these sakes in the soshu flavor profile, they tend to be light, less fragrant than the kunshus, and cleaner. Okay, so if you're comparing the Ginjos and the Daiginjos to the Hanjozos and the namas are going to be a little cleaner tasting, not quite as fruity, okay, and they're going to be less fragrant than the Ginjos and the Daiginjos. And also, I also view the soshu flavor profiles as an analog to white wine. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you have jukushu. This is the third flavor profile, and these are aged sakes. Now, aged sakes tend to be heavier and more full-bodied because they've been aged. They've developed some character in the bottle or in the aging container. These sakes tend to be more fragrant. They've developed fragrance in the aging process, and I view them as being more of a red wine analog. They're not red. They're not wine. They don't taste like red wine, but they're more of an analog to red wine compared to the kunshus and the soshus, which are more of an analog to white wine. The fourth flavor profile is junshu, and these are the junmais. So remember, junmai is made only with sake, rice, and koji. Only made with water, rice, and koji. And the kumotos and the yamahai. Remember, kumoto, that's the old-fashioned method that's made with the stirring process, and the yamahai, which is the old-fashioned process made without the stirring process. These tend to be heavier and more full-bodied, and they tend to be less fragrant, though, than the jukushu, less fragrant than the aged sakes. And these also I view as being a red wine analog. So if we're going to kind of sum this up, you would look at the ginjos and the daiginjos as being the most refined sakes, and they're going to be lighter, fruitier, and fragrant. The soshus, they're going to be less fragrant, but still light, and that's the Hanjozos, the unpasteurized namasake, and the futushu. And then on the other side of the spectrum, to sum up, you have the jukushu, which these are the aged sakes, so they're going to be heavier, they're going to be fragrant, and then the junshus, which are heavier and less fragrant. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about sweetness and dryness. Now, many bottles have an SMV value on them, a sake meter value. Sake meter value measures the density of the sake versus the density of water. A higher value, that's a plus number, has a lower density and tends to be drier, okay? A lower number, lower sake meter value number, which has a negative sign, that tends to be a higher density, and that tends to be sweeter. However, a +6 may taste sweeter than a -6, but not necessarily. Now, these numbers do not appear on all sake lists or wine lists, and they don't appear on all bottles. And you should view them only as a rough guide, okay? In fact, I'm paying less and less attention to these numbers as I learned more and more about sake. The reason for this is because there are other factors that affect whether you perceive a sake to be, my camera cut out again. I was saying that there are other factors that affect the perception of dryness or sweetness other than sake meter value, and one of those factors is acidity. Now, acidity can affect the apparent sweetness or dryness of a sake. Now, the higher the acidity, it will seem drier. The lower the acidity, it will seem sweeter. Now, the acidity values for sake usually run between 1.0 and 2.0. That's not a very wide range, and in fact, most of them fall in the range of about 1.3 to 1.6, very narrow range. So it's very hard for anyone to look at that acidity number and view it in conjunction with the SMV number and make any kind of a judgment as to how sweet or dry it's going to taste before you actually taste it. Those two factors work together, and it's really hard, I think, to predict whether an SMV number in conjunction with a sake acidity number is going to give you a dry or sweet sake. Really what you need to do is taste it. If you taste it and you think it's sweet, then it's sweet, all right? And if you taste it and you think it's dry, then it's dry. Now, other factors that affect the apparent sweetness or dryness of sake are the alcohol content. And alcohol content, as I said, usually is around 1.5%, but it can be higher. And another factor that affects the apparent sweetness and dryness is food pairing. Now, daiginjos and finer sakes like that, sometimes you may be drinking them just on their own, and you may not be pairing them with sake. You won't be pairing them with food. So whatever you taste as sweet or dry is just by tasting the sake. But if you pair the sake with food, you may have a different opinion as to whether it's sweet or dry. In other words, if you taste the sake on its own, you may say, oh, this tastes a little sweet. But if you then taste it with some food, you might think, oh, it tastes drier, right? So all of these factors, the pairing with the food, the alcohol content, the acidity, and the sake meter value, they all affect the apparent sweetness or dryness of the sake. So you might not think that a -6 sake meter value sake tastes much sweeter than a +4. It's really just a matter of taste and how the other factors play into it. Okay, now let's talk about the serving temperature of sakes. Most good sakes, the finer sakes, ginjos, daiginjos, hanjozos, most good sake should not be heated. Now, Japanese restaurants, and really what I mean is Japanese restaurants in the United States, serve heated sake pretty regularly, pretty commonly, because some Americans think it should be heated and they like it that way, and that's fine. But in Japan, there's not nearly as much heated sake, and you'll find it more in the winter months, you'll find it more in colder areas, but you won't find them heating the finer sakes. Now, I will talk about temperature ranges for sake, but despite the temperature ranges that are proper for sake, I prefer my sake to be chilled, okay? I may be missing out by doing that, because by chilling the sake, you can suppress some aroma, you can suppress some complexity, and you can bring out a little bitterness. But I personally like to have my sake chilled. But there are proper temperature ranges for the different flavor profiles that I talked about. Kushu, Soshu, Jukushu, Junshu, they all have a proper temperature range. All right, we'll talk about that. Now, the sake will be served in various types of serving containers. And you'll see more and more today that sake is being served in various types of glassware. And that's fine too, but traditionally you would serve sake in something like this, which is an ochoko or ochoko. And they're often made out of ceramic, and they are often kind of rounded and have maybe even an irregular shape, like they've been handmade. This is from a set, so that we have a bunch of these, and so they're all exactly uniform. Also, sake may sometimes be served in a little wooden cup, a cedar cup, which brings out some fragrance and taste. Okay, let's talk about the actual proper temperatures for serving the different types of sake. Now, the kunshu flavor profile, which is again the ginjos and the daiginjos, these are best served slightly chilled around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, now the Soshu flavor profile, which is the Hanjozos, the Nama, that's the unpasteurized, and the Futsushu, that's the table sake, these can be served at varying temperatures. And in fact, this is the only category where the temperature can actually be properly served hot. What does hot mean? 122 degrees Fahrenheit. It can also be served chilled, and chilled isn't the same as slightly chilled. The kunshu, that's the ginjos and the daiginjos, those were served slightly chilled at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The Soshu, on the other hand, the Hanjozos and the Namas and the Futsushu, they can be served more chilled, meaning 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And they can also be served slightly chilled, like the ginjos and the daiginjos. So, just to recap that, the ginjos and the daiginjos in the kunshu profile, 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The Soshu flavor profile, which is the Hanjozos, Namas, and the Futsushu, they can be served 3 different temperatures. Hot, 122 degrees. Chilled, 41 degrees. Or slightly chilled, 50 degrees, all Fahrenheit. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you have the Jukushu and the Junshu. Now, the Jukushu, remember, those are the aged sakes. And these are served best at a little below room temperature up to room temperature. When I say a little below, I mean like around 59 degrees Fahrenheit up to around room temperature. And then finally the Junshus, which are the Junmais, the Komotos, and the Yamahais. Those are best served a little bit below room temperature up to about room temperature. So again, that's about 59 degrees up to about 70 degrees. Or slightly warm, which is 104 degrees. Contrast that with the Soshu, the Hanjozos, the Namos, and the Futsushu, which can be served hot at 122. The Junshus should not be served so hot. They can be served slightly warm at 104. But having said all of that, again, it's a matter of personal preference. I like my sake chilled. I like all of my sake chilled. It's rare for me to drink sake even at room temperature. I like to pour a small amount into this container at a time so that it stays cold. I often ask servers or bartenders if they can put my sake bottle into a chiller or into a bucket of ice so I keep it cold. I only pour out a little bit at a time so it stays cold all the time. But that's me. You might like it in exactly the temperatures that I've given you for the various types of flavor profiles. Now let's talk a little bit about pairing sake with food. Sake has great food pairing ability. Some people think it has better food pairing ability than wine does. And now, with the food pairing, there are no hard and fast rules here. And but there are certain things that you may find. And one is that sake pairs especially well with shellfish. The reason for this is that it has 4 times the amount of succinic acid compared to wine. And this enables it to pair better with seafood. Now, warmer sakes, and again, these are the sakes that should be warmed, not just any sake, but the sakes with the flavor profile that are best served warm. Those pair well with meat. Okay? Sake also has less tartaric acid than wine, which gives it kind of a mellow mouthfeel. And the last thing I'll say about pairing with food is that sometimes sake is best enjoyed alone. All right? I really like to drink sake just on its own. The daiginjos and the ginjos, the tokubetsus, remember that means special, those you may enjoy best without food. Just a word about sources of information. For a more in-depth understanding of sake, I recommend the Sake Advisor certification from the Sake School of America, which is www.sakeschoolofamerica.com. I have their sake certification. This is not the same level as a sommelier. A sommelier is a lot harder, a lot more work. I don't have that. But they also offer a sommelier course. They also have a lot of great articles about sake, and they also do other types of things like virtual tours. They'll have a brewery tour, virtual brewery tour of a brewery in Japan. Fascinating, really interesting. For a great selection of sakes that where the information has been translated into English, I suggest tipsysake.com. This is www.tippsysake.com. Those are 2 great sources of information. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you liked it. I hope it makes it easier for you to understand and to order sake, and it increases your enjoyment of this great beverage. Please remember to subscribe to my channel, and thanks for watching.